This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. There were big plans for the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Very few of them will be happening. That modern-day invader, COVID-19, has the UK stuck in the house, other than those battling against the infection itself, the frontline workers. But our editorial column remembers not just VE Day itself, but what came after, and says that's just as important.
Advance Britannia. The Evening Standard's headline said 75 years ago, as the war in Europe ended. But as we mark that moment, we should also remember what came next. Economic pain brought austerity. A global effort brought new international institutions to shape growth, bring peace, and fight pandemics. Things like the UN and the World Health Organization, which are under pressure today. Politics changed too. In 1945, no one knew how all this would happen, but they wanted to see a better world come out of the fight, and they gave their trust to leaders with big plans. The lessons for our recovery from the fight we face today are clear. Be ambitious, work together, don't give up hope. But don't think it will be easy either.
The Evening Standard columnist Matthew Dancona, who's also an editor at the Tortoise news site, has written about VE Day and what we can learn from it for the paper and joins me now. Matthew, first of all, this is not the 75th anniversary we'd expected.
No, absolutely. And this has been an anniversary long in the planning. The bank holiday was moved to Friday so that we could all engage in public festivities. We could enjoy the big processions and marches that were going to be through the centre of London. And of course, none of that is now possible because of the lockdown. So it's going to be a very strange experience because we're going to be, in a way, celebrating the end of the war in Europe in 1945, but in a way that more closely resembles the curfews during the conflict inside our homes. So we'll be able to watch the Queen's televised address, which will bring back memories of her father, George VI's address on VE Day, no doubt. There's going to be a virtual duet with Catherine Jenkins and Dame Vera Lynn. There's going to be a 2-minute silence, things like that. But it will be a virtual VE Day, not a physical one. So it's going to be quite a poignant experience, I think.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of people drawing parallels between that time, like you said, those curfews during the actual war itself, and now. Is that the wrong thing to do, Matt?
I think it is wrong because the moment we're at in the pandemic crisis is not really comparable to VE Day. If anything, it's closer to 1940 and the Churchill's darkest hour. You know, we may have got through the worst bit. Let's hope. But I think that if there are lessons of VE Day, actually, they're quite the opposite, which is that conflicts and struggles tend to have quite untidy endings. There's a great book by Martin Gilbert, Churchill's biographer, all about VE Day, and what he found, going back to people who'd actually been alive and in London and elsewhere on VE Day, was that although there was a huge party, there was also a great deal of a sense of flatness and bereavement and concern and worry about the future. And I think there's a lot to be learnt from that, because coming out of this phase of the coronavirus crisis, and we're expecting some announcements from Boris Johnson on Sunday to that effect, we're going to move out into quite a messy, incremental relaxation, I think, where some freedoms are restored, but not all.
Do you think then that people are going to be disappointed? Do you think they're expecting to have like a massive, right, you can all go outside now, run around, hug each other kind of moment?
Well, I think the problem is that the thing that made the lockdown work was that it was incredibly straightforward and simple and easy to understand, which is Boris Johnson goes on television, 27 million people watch, March the 23rd. He gives, in his own words, the instruction to the public to stay at home. I think the problem is that once the message gets more complicated, compliance gets more complicated, I think people will become quite easily and understandably confused. They're now, it seems that they're going to be told that they can exercise as much as they want, but at the same time, they can't do team sports. So does that mean they can go for a kickabout in the park, but only on their own? And the danger in all of this is that because of the complexity, the whole social distancing safety regime that the government has put in place collapses because of its sheer lack of clarity. And of course, the danger of that is that the rate of infection rises again and we hit a second peak. So inside government, the people I've been talking to desperately want to get the economy revving up again. They desperately want to get consumption going again, but they're also very nervous about the rate of change and what will actually happen and the potential consequences if the lockdown unwinds in the wrong or too hasty a fashion.
In 75 years, Matt, will people look back on this generation in a similar way to we look back on the generation that saw victory in Europe?
Well, I think that this pandemic can't stand direct comparison with the Second World War because something like 75 million people died in that conflict, and an entire people, Jewish people, faced industrialized extinction. What I think is true is that every generation faces a sort of defining struggle. And I must confess that I thought 9/11 might be it, or possibly the financial crash and its long aftermath. But clearly, this is going to be the defining story of our lifetimes. Bank of England has announced forecasts that show that the economic outlook is going to be very, very tough for a long time. We know that the same is happening in Europe. America is a mess. We haven't yet seen what it's going to do to the developing countries. So I think that how we handle this crisis and the lessons we learn from it will be written up in the history books, and it will be the way in which our generation is judged. Absolutely.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.